My dear students and viewers, this is Puranjay Biswas, Professor and Chairman, Department of English, Dhaka College, affiliated with the University of Dhaka. I welcome you to my today's lecture on Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, which is called the first English literary criticism written in defense of poetry. My dear students, today I want to discuss Sidney's definition of poetry, classification of poetry, kinds of poets, and so on. At first, let me focus on the definition of poetry, which is given in paragraph 13 of the text. According to Sir Philip Sidney, poesy therefore is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to tease and delight. If we discuss this definition, we can find some basic concepts about poetry. At first, Sidney says that poetry is an art of imitation. And this very term has been used by Aristotle in his Poetics, and that word for imitation is mimesis. Mimesis means imitation. And what does Aristotle mean by imitation? Imitation is a kind of representation of reality or real life, but not as it is, but what it should be or might be according to possibility or probability. So, imitation is a kind of ideal reproduction of reality, blending with the poet's concept, thoughts and ideas, emotions and feelings, imagination and colors. So, a reality turns into imitation. In fact, Sir Philip Sidney is a brainchild of Aristotle. Aristotle wrote his Poetics in reply to his master Plato, who makes bitter criticism of poetry in his masterpiece, The Republic. While Plato speaks against poetry, Aristotle speaks for poetry. In fact, the Poetics is called the first and most scientific literary critique written in defense of poetry. Sir Philip Sidney follows Aristotle, and here is a reference to Aristotle while he is giving the definition of poetry. He also says that it is a kind of speaking picture. Sidney explains that an artist depicts a picture with the help of his brush and colors, but his picture can't speak. On the contrary, According to Sydney, poetry can speak with the readers. A poet creates a picture with the selection of his words and phrases and sentences, and represents in such a way that a poet, through his poetry, speaks to the readers. And this poetry removes the readers to virtue and delight. And at the end of his definition, Sydney mentions the purpose or aim of poetry. He says that the end of poetry is to tease and delight. So, there are two main purposes of poetry. First, it teases. Secondly, it gives delight. In this respect, I want to mention two different concepts about the end of poetry. The classical concept of poetry is that the purpose of poetry is to tease, is to reform, is to give some message, reformative lesson that can help us to build up our life, and society, and to reform the world. That is art for life's sake. According to the classical concept, poetry is to tease, is to give some message, moral teaching. Sydney also takes this concept of classical critics. And again, what is the concept of the romantic critics? According to a romantic concept, the end of poetry is to delight, is to give pleasure. The romanticists do not believe in moral teaching of poetry. Wordsworth says that if a poem can give the readers pleasure, that's all. And it is the best kind of poem. However, Sydney has made a compromising concept about the aim of poetry. He has taken both the concepts of the classicists and the romanticists. So, Sydney says that the true end of poetry is both to teach and delight. My dear students, now I want to discuss how Sydney categorizes the poets. In paragraph 17 of his text, he categorizes the poets into three classes. At first, he says that the chief poets, who are rather called Vase, according to the Roman people, the Romans, regarded the poets to be Veds. And the word Veds means diviner, foreseer, or a prophet. That is, Sidney wants to mean that the chief poets who belong to the first category speak of divine excellences of poetry. The poets of this first category included David's Psalms, Solomon's songs, Ecclesiastes, as well as Proverbs, which are the part of poetic creation. Again, they included Moses and Deborah and their hymns to be a kind of poetry having divine excellences. Sidney also says that this category of poets included songs of Orpheus, Amphion, and Homer. They contributed a lot to write poems and songs as well as music in praise of God or divinity. Then Sidney moves to the second category of poets. And the main concern that we find is historical matters, philosophical matters, and this category of poets included Tiresias, Phocides, and Cato's morals, part of poetry. Not only that, Lucan's historical matters also are included in this section. Then Sidney also says that some poets like Lucretius, Virgil, who deal with matters which are natural. At last, Sidney mentions the third category of poets who are called true poets, and they mainly imitate. I have already discussed the definition of Sidney, and poetry is mainly a kind of imitation, art of imitation, as Aristotle says. And the last class of poets follow this concept of Aristotle. The Greek people regarded the poets as maker, creator, and the word that they used is poem. And this word poem in Greek language means to create, to make. So, the poets are in fact maker, creator. That is, they imitate reality with their creativity, imaginations, own concepts, and ideas and thoughts. As for example, Sidney has mentioned Xenophon, Heliodorus, who were called true poets in the ancient time. Okay? My dear students, after it, Sidney has classified poetry into some categories, such as pastoral poetry, elegiac poetry, satiric poetry, lyric poetry, comic, tragic, and heroic. So these are the fundamental classification of poetry. Sidney has explained the usefulness and significance of different types of poetic forms, as I have already mentioned. He says that pastoral poems have a great significance and importance to us, and none can disagree that pastoral poetry is useless. Secondly, elegiac poetry has also a great meaning. It helps us form sympathy, compassion, and it gives us the strength of consolation. Then satiric poetry. We can't ignore this type of poetry. Satiric poetry exposes the ugliness, vices, absurdities, oddities of our society, of institution, of community, even of the individuals. And there is a great purpose of satirical poetry. It exposes weakness, follies and faults with a view to reformation, correction, amendment. So, satirical poetry helps us be reformed, helps us to be reformed. Then, lyric poetry. Lyric poetry helps us express our emotions, our feelings with sweet and musical components. So lyric poetry is on the one hand very much sweet, pleasant and musical, giving us much delight. So he says that none can blame or none should blame all these types of poetic forms. Then if we come to comic poetry, a comedy, it has also a great value Because in a comedy, we find entertainment that provides us with some delight. And the delight is a sole purpose of poetry. And we need this delight. So, comedy can play a vital role in the life of the audience, giving them delight and pleasure. Tragic poetry, that is tragedy, according to Aristotle, tragedy is the best form of art, best form of poetry. It is superior to comedy, even epic. Sir Philip Sidney also thinks that tragedy has enormous importance that arouses pity and fear in the mind of the audience, bringing about catharsis. The hamartia or the error of judgment or tragic flaw of the tragic character helps us to be purgated. The emotions of pity and fear have a great impact on the mind of the audience. And through these emotions of pity and fear, the audience cannot but be purgated, purified. That is catharsis. Catharsis is a kind of tragic pleasure or cleansing. It clarifies, tragedy clarifies, purifies, and purgates the mind of the audience through realization, regeneration, moral edification. Thus, tragedy cannot be blamed or bitterly criticized because it is an important form of art. Sidney upholds heroic poetry. Heroic poetry has also immense value in our life. When we come to know the heroic action, adventure, courage, noble mission of the heroic character like Achilles, Aeneas, Odysseus, we are greatly benefited. Our mind, our thoughts, our character, all are greatly inspired by the great deeds and actions of the heroes reflected in heroic poetry like epic poem. Thus, Sidney wants to mean that the different forms of poetry have great significance and value in our life, in our society. So they cannot be criticized, blamed or ignored or rejected by so-called critics like Stephen Gossel. My students, then Sydney also discusses the importance of meter and verse form. Now, what is Sydney's concept about meter and verse form? He says that meter, that is rhyming and versifying, are ornament of poetry. Meter or verse form are used to beautify, to adorn poetry, but they are not essential part of poetry. As a gown does not mean that one who puts on gown is a lawyer or advocate. In the same way, meter or verse form cannot make one a true poet, and mere versifying and using of meter cannot make some writing true poetry. He says that one can be a poet without using rhyme and verse form, without using meter. In the same way, a versifier cannot be a true poet. Mere versifying cannot make one a poet. So, Sydney has made a clear concept that meter, verse form, all these are optional for poetry. They are not mandatory. My students, then Sydney discusses superiority of poetry over all arts. And from paragraph 18 to paragraph 34, Sydney says that poetry is the highest form of learning. It is the highest form of art. It is the most antique and fatherly art. It comes first, and all other branches of knowledge and learning are greatly indebted to poetry because they had their origin from poetry. According to Sydney, poetry gives us first milk like a nurse, the soft liquid food. Milk is given at first to a newborn baby. In the same way, poetry is the first food for all those who are ignorant, for all those who want to learn. So poetry is called the first light giver to the ignorant. All sciences are subordinate to poetry. Sydney says that a scientist is first a poet, then a scientist. And the crown of glory goes to the poet. Sidney mentions some branches of knowledge and learnings such as philosophy or moral philosophy, history, astronomy, and other sciences. He shows argument and logic to establish the superiority of poetry over all other arts and learnings. He says that both philosophy and history have some sort of shortcomings and faults. As for example, history only teaches us through concrete example, but it can't give us any general precept. On the other hand, philosophy teaches us only through abstract, difficult, obscure precept without any concrete example or references. So both philosophy and history have some lackings. History doesn't use abstract precept, while philosophy doesn't use concrete example. Thus both are faulty, defective. On the contrary, poetry possesses both qualities that history and philosophy lack. By this I want to mean that on the one hand, poetry gives us abstract general precepts. On the other hand, it gives us concrete example. Both the processes of philosophy and history are found in poetry. Thus, poetry is superior to both history and philosophy. Sidney also argues that philosophy teaches only the taught, that is, only the learned people, but the common people cannot learn from philosophy, and philosophy is not appealing to all classes of people. On the other hand, history gives us only a particular individual fact that happened in the past, but it can't give us any universal truths. But it is poetry which gives us, which moves us to both virtue and delight. Stephen Gosson and his followers believe that poetry is the mother of lies, poets are great liars, but Sidney, following his great master Aristotle, says that poetry speaks the truth. It moves us to virtue as well as delight. So poetry has charming effect on us. It can fascinate a child, an adult, even an old person. Thus, Sydney establishes the superiority of poetry to all other forms of art, learnings, and knowledge. My dear student, this is all. See you next. All the best.